This right here is a bourbon with an Irish twist. This week, let me tell you about the Townbranch Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the Whiskey Nerd, and like I said, this is a bourbon with a bit of an Irish twist. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now, first off, what do I mean when I say it's a bourbon with an Irish twist? Well, the Townbranch brewing, the Townbranch brand comes from the Lexington Brewing and Distilling company in the town of Lexington in America. And that kind of distillery, that brewery, was kind of founded or refounded by an Irish guy called Dr. Pearse Lyons. And he has sadly passed away, but he was a bit of an entrepreneur. He was a bit of a scientist. He was a bit of a businessman. And he had this company called Alltech, where they worked on yeasts and pharmaceutical products and animal feed and all sorts of weird things, but it was always about working with grains, working with natural products to make them a little bit better. So a natural fit for him was a brewery. So he opened up the Lexington Brewing Company and he worked on making beers. He made really kind of interesting beers that were kind of aged in barrels, and they had different kind of mash bills. And then a kind of an evolution of that was the Lexington Brewing Company became the Lexington Brewing and Distilling Company, and they opened up that kind of distillery side of the business only a couple of years ago, and now they have this Townbranch brand. They've got a rye whiskey, which I'll be reviewing in a couple of weeks. If you want to see that, make sure to check back. But they've also got different kind of expressions of this. I think this was originally a non-age statement bourbon, but now it's a straight bourbon whiskey. So that means it's at least 4 years old, but up to this point they were selling it as just a bourbon whiskey, which means it kind of could be any age. This company is part of, like as I said, a kind of a wider company owned by Dr. Pearse Lyons, who has, like I said, sadly passed away. And they have a distillery here in Dublin called the Pearse Lyons Distillery, which is in an old church, and they've been releasing whiskey. So if you go to their distilleries, you can buy the bourbons in the Irish distillery, or you can buy the Irish whiskies in the American distillery. So it is kind of an interesting way of looking at the two different brands. And I think as they kind of grow up together, as those two distilleries grow up together, they're probably going to maybe do some interesting blends of those two distilleries working together. They'll probably do cask finishes where a bourbon gets finished maybe in an Irish whiskey cask to see what happens there, because oftentimes Irish whiskey is aged in a bourbon cask. So I'd like to see what would happen if you took a bourbon raw spirit and put that into an Irish cask, see how it kind of aged, see how it came along. But like I said, they're still kind of young. This is only a straight product, so it's about 4 years old, maybe a little bit older. But I'd like to see what they do with it down the line, where they experiment a little bit more. It is a high malt mash bill apparently. So the company was I think they made the first malt whiskey since prohibition in the town of Lexington, so they kind of are proud of that. So they use a lot of malt in their mash bill. It is 72% corn, it's 13% rye and 15% malted barley. So you're going to get a lot of kind of biscuity flavors, but that core kind of corn, the rye, the spiciness of a bourbon is going to be there. It comes in at 45% alcohol by volume, or 90 proof, and it's, like I said, it's a bourbon. It's a straight bourbon, it has no age statement. Straight bourbon without an age statement means it's at least 4 years old, so I'm guessing it's around that 4-year-old mark. And I think that's about all there is to say about it, so I'm just going to go in for the nose on the Townbranch Straight Bourbon Whiskey. Cheers. Okay, it is immediately very sweet. Like, you get that hit of the corn, like the hit of the bourbon, the corn whiskey, you get that sweetness, you get a bit of vanilla, you get a bit of caramel, you get like a kind of a maple syrup note I'm getting on this, because when you have that, like the spirit in the virgin American oak, the white oak, you get that spiciness. So for me, the sweetness, that kind of caramelly note with a little bit of an oak, a little bit of a woody kind of twist, it really does remind me of maple syrup, where you get that, like that sweetness with a little bit of a woody, earthy twist. There is still spice in here, like there is a bit of white pepper. It's not super spicy, like I'd say it's more on that baking spice, like the cinnamon, the nutmeg, that kind of thing. But there is a little bit of like a heat there. There's a little bit of like white pepper, but not a huge amount. It's more on those kind of baking spices. There's, yeah, like some kind of cooked or like toasted hazelnuts coming through as well. There's definitely a little bit of nuttiness, and there's actually a fair bit of fruit on here. Like I'm getting citrus. I'm getting like orange peel, orange zest, that sort of stuff. But also a little bit of like a cherry candy, like a cherry hard candy, where you get that sugary sweetness, you get that kind of the flavor of the cherry with that caramelized sugar, with that cooked sugar, and it comes through. Yeah, definitely with that bit of like cherry. I wouldn't say like a fresh cherry, like that cherry flavor in a candy, that kind of flavor. So I think that's enough on the nose. I'm gonna go in for the palate here. Cheers. It is sweet and then very quickly turns dry. So like immediately up front, you get caramel, you get that bit of citrus, you get that little bit of cherry, you get all those kind of sweet flavors. And then as soon as it spreads out over your palate, you get dry notes, you get earthy notes, you get like a little bit of like a cigar. I don't smoke cigars, but like if what I imagine a cigar box kind of tastes like, that from that smell, there's like a little bit of like the leather. Again, I don't eat leather obviously, but like you get that kind of the leathery note from the nose, that kind of that flavor comes through into the palate, like that smell of leather into the palate. It's kind of drying, it's kind of earthy, it's not super spicy. Like I didn't actually get a huge amount of spice. It was more sweet and dry and earthy as opposed to spicy. Like on the nose, cinnamon, like I said, a bit of pepper. And then on the palate, it was more those earthy, spicy notes. So I'm going to go in again for another sip and see if I can get the spicy notes as opposed to just the earthy notes. Cheers. Yeah, second sip round, I let it sit in my mouth a little bit. I got a little bit of spice, but it was so light. A little bit of like that peppery spice, because they do use pot stills, so you get a little bit of that peppery spice, but it's mostly that earthy, dry note with that sweetness. Like on the second sip round, it didn't get as dry. I think the sweetness kind of lasted a little bit more. There was no burn of the ABV. It is at 45%, so it's not super high. It's 90 proof. That's reasonable for drinking. It's not super strong. No real burn, no real heat. Just kind of from the nose, I was almost expecting more flavor on the palate to come through, but it's not unpleasant. Just like there's a little bit of kind of peppery spice on the second sip round. Like I got a touch of it, like they do use pot stills when they're making the whiskey, so that gives you a little bit of extra peppery spice, but it was more on that kind of earthy note. Like I said, like second sip round, I will say, was a bit sweeter. Like it wasn't as immediately drying out. I got a little bit more of that caramel, a little bit more like that kind of maple syrup, that sweetness, that kind of sticky sweetness, that kind of flavor was through a little bit. Again, that citrus peel, a little bit of cherry, that kind of flavor came through. There's no real burn on it. It's coming in at 90 proof, 45% alcohol, which is solid for drinking. It's not going to give you any burn. But the flavors are almost like a little bit lighter. Like the nose was promising very kind of almost strong flavors, like really a rich bourbon experience. On the palate, much lighter, like that drying note, I think maybe makes it lighten out a little bit and not be as like full flavored as I might expect from the nose. So I'm going to go in again for another sip, but we're going to focus on the finish. Cheers. Okay, so on the finish, like I said, up front you get that sweetness, get the drying, earthy notes. On the finish, after a breath, after a little bit of a, it's pretty light, it's pretty gone. Like there is a little bit of like the sweetness, there's a little bit of like that maple syrup hanging on, but like the citrus is pretty much gone. The spice, again, it's as if I've had something spiced a little while ago, like got that cinnamon, got that nutmeg, but it's not really strong. A little bit of like an oaky, tannic note at the end, but like it's all very light. It's all very kind of, the finish is quite short, basically, I'm trying to say. The finish is very short. Same kind of notes as in the palate, but just much lighter, much quick fade off on the finish. So I'd say it's definitely a short finish. Before I give my final thoughts on this bourbon, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews like this every Wednesday, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday, and I will have a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey this Friday. So if you want to see that, make sure you scroll down, hit that subscribe button, hit that thumbs up button, and while you're there, let me know in a comment what kind of whiskeys you want to see me review in future, and if there are any cocktail recipes you think I should check out. Now, as to my final thoughts on this, it's a bourbon. I think that's a fair description of it. It's not mind-blowing. It's not going to change your life. It is a fairly solid bourbon. I got this, like I said, at the distillery here in Ireland, so it didn't have to pay like the store markup, so it was fairly inexpensive as bourbon whiskies go in Ireland. I think it was about €50, so it's not super expensive. It's not going to break the bank. It's fine. It's nice. It's a bourbon. It's, like I said, got a kind of a full flavour on the nose, the palate a little bit light, the finish quite light. So I don't think I would feel guilty using this in a cocktail. I don't think this would be like a special occasion bourbon that I would like the bottle does look cool, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it would be like a special occasion bourbon. I think it's just a nice kind of middle of the road bourbon. If you want that kind of bourbon flavour, you can go for this. But maybe if you want like that classic bourbon flavour to go in a cocktail, things like Wild Turkey are going to deliver that same flavour, but at a little bit of a cheaper price. So I think it's fine. I want to see where the distillery goes. Like I said, they're still pretty young. I want to see if they experiment between the Irish and the American sides of the kind of distillery company. So I want to see where they go. Not a bad product, just not life-changing. So I think, like I said, it's not bad. I'm going to finish this glass and I'll see you next time. Sláinte.